A millionaire swore in front of everyone that she would be his wife, no matter the cost. She never ever knew the touch of another man in her life. But on their wedding night, the millionaire discovers. If this story got your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Alexander Steele always believed that love was a weakness that men couldn't afford. At 39, owner of a hotel empire stretching from the sun-drenched beaches of Malibu to luxury resorts hidden among the palm trees of Key West, he lived his life under the weight of traumas that never healed. His childhood marked by humiliation in the slums of Los Angeles, by maternal abandonment, and by the tragedy that befell his family, shaped a cold, calculating man who transformed each wound into stone and each painful memory into tempered steel. Alexander's smile never reached the grey eyes that once cried from hunger and desperation. His fingers, now adorned with a platinum Rolex that cost more than many houses in East LA, held million-dollar contracts signed in offices overlooking the Hollywood Hills, not tender caresses of someone who knows love. His lips, which once begged for a plate of food on the busy corners of Santa Monica Boulevard, now sealed deals that moved millions of dollars, never whispered promises in the ear of a beloved woman. From the penthouse of his most luxurious hotel in Newport Beach, an architectural work that defied the Pacific winds with its modern lines and mirrored glass, Alexander contemplated the same turbulent sea that witnessed his meteoric rise from the dark alleys of Compton to the golden halls of California's elite. Those blue waters held secrets he would never share with anyone, memories he preferred to bury beneath tons of concrete, imported marble, and financial success. The source of his deepest pain carried a name that echoed through the halls of California: high society, a surname pronounced with reverence in exclusive clubs of Beverly Hills and Malibu. Harrison. Decades ago, when America still lived under the shadow of Cold War tensions and big business was conducted in closed rooms, far from the curious eyes of the press, the patriarch of the traditional Harrison family, Henry, driven by ancestral greed and the class pride that ran in his aristocratic veins, destroyed Alexander's humble home irreparably and cowardly. A scandal involving Carmen, Alexander's mother, and Henry Harrison himself, hidden for years under the mantle of silence bought and sold by the California elite, led to the suicide of the only woman Alexander truly loved in life. Carmen was a Latina with brown eyes and a sweet smile, who had migrated from New Mexico to Los Angeles seeking a better life for her young son. She worked as a cleaner in the Harrison Group offices during the cold early mornings, when the city slept, and she scrubbed the marble floors where men walked, who earned in one day what she couldn't save in an entire year. Her natural beauty, even hidden under faded uniforms and hands calloused by hard work, caught the predatory attention of Henry Harrison, who seduced her with empty promises of a better life, apartments in Brentwood, jewelry, and expensive dresses. Carmen, naive, like so many poor women who believe in fairy tales whispered by powerful men, gave herself body and soul, dreaming of a future that would never come. When she discovered she carried another of Henry's children in her womb, a child who would never be officially recognized, he simply discarded her like a used tissue. Henry's wife, a cold and calculating woman from the high society of Pasadena, when she learned of the extramarital affair that threatened the family's immaculate reputation, personally ensured that Carmen would never find decent work in Los Angeles again. She used the influence of the Harrison name to close all doors, transforming the Latina woman's life into a silent hell of humiliation and growing misery. Without money for rent in their Compton apartment, without hope of finding another job, with 2 small children to feed, and the certainty that the world had conspired against her, Carmen took an entire bottle of sleeping pills on a rainy March night, while Alexander, then only 16, worked selling peanuts on Venice Beach until late at night. Alexander arrived home that March dawn with pockets full of coins and crumpled bills, enough to buy milk and bread for his younger siblings' breakfast. The 2-room apartment in Compton was immersed in darkness that seemed different to him, denser, colder. He called for his mother, but only silence answered. It was in the tiny bedroom they shared that he found Carmen, dressed in the only pretty dress she owned, the one she had worn on her first date with Henry Harrison, lying on the single bed as if it were just another night of sleep. But the blue lips and cold skin told a different story. Beside the bed, the empty pill bottle and a letter written in the trembling handwriting of someone who had already given up on living. "My son, forgive your mother for not being strong enough to face this cruel world. Take care of your siblings. Don't let them go through the humiliation I went through. You are different, Alexander. You have fire in your eyes. Use that fire to be greater than all of them." That dawn, holding the cold body of the woman who gave her life for him, something died inside Alexander. But something much more dangerous was born, a thirst for justice that would transform into a thirst for revenge, a hatred that would grow like a weed in the heart of a boy who had to become a man at 16, burying his mother with money he got from selling the only gold ring she owned, a grandmother's inheritance she had kept for moments of desperation. 23 years had passed since that night. Alexander was no longer the skinny, desperate teenager who sold peanuts and cold water on Newport Beach, running among the tanned bodies of rich tourists who didn't even look at his face when buying his products. Through a lethal combination of brutal intelligence, unwavering determination, and an almost supernatural ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles, he built an empire that defied the very traditional families that once humiliated him. Every dollar he earned, every property he bought in Manhattan Beach or Palm Springs, every international contract he signed was a calculated step toward the day when he would step on the Harrisons' neck. He studied law at a public university, working during the day and attending classes at night. He taught himself French and Spanish, memorizing dictionaries in the dim candlelight when the electricity was cut off. He absorbed knowledge about business, economics, and politics like a sponge absorbs water, always with a crystal-clear objective in mind: to become powerful, enough to destroy those who destroyed his family. And now, finally, after decades of patient waiting, that day had come. The traditional Harrison family, which once owned entire farms stretching through the winding valleys of Southern California, which flaunted surnames in the society columns of Pasadena and Santa Barbara newspapers, which frequented the most exclusive boxes at the Hollywood Bowl and owned permanent seats at Santa Anita Park, was broke, completely ruined. The poor investment decisions of recent years, the corruption that finally came to light with FBI operations, the debts accumulated over a decade of mismanagement and excessive spending had led what remained of the Harrison empire to the most humiliating ruin. Assets were being auctioned, farms mortgaged, bank accounts frozen by the IRS. Alexander knew about their bankruptcy even before the Harrisons themselves fully understood the extent of the financial hole they were in. His lawyers, his accountants, his informants strategically spread throughout the country's financial system, ensured that he was the first creditor to knock on the proud family's door. And he didn't just come to collect forgotten debts or accumulated interest. He came to collect blood. He came to claim what he considered rightfully his, the complete humiliation of those who dared humiliate his mother. For him, there was no sweeter or more poetic revenge than possessing that which should never be his. Rebecca Harrison, the only legitimate daughter of the man who caused Carmen's death. The spoiled heiress who grew up among imported vineyards and Arabian horses on the family's century-old estates, who studied at the most expensive and exclusive schools in Southern California, who never had to choose between buying food or medicine, who never felt the humiliation of having the electricity cut off or the embarrassment of wearing donated clothes. Rebecca Harrison, at 27, was the porcelain princess who still lived protected in the golden bubble that her father's money and influence had meticulously built around her, a woman who knew 5 languages but never needed to work a single day, who played classical piano but never heard the deafening noise of a shack being built with old wood, who could quote French poets but was unfamiliar with the bitter taste of hunger or the cutting cold of sleeping without a blanket. And now this same Rebecca would be his, not for love, not by choice, but out of necessity, by a cold and calculated contract that would seal her fate forever. Rebecca Harrison woke up that Thursday morning, as she had done for the last 27 years of her life, to the soft sound of classical music playing on the mansion's sound system in Pacific Palisades, with the delicate aroma of Colombian coffee prepared by Mercedes, the housekeeper who had been taking care of the family for more than 2 decades. Through her bedroom window, she could see the impeccably maintained gardens that extended as far as the eye could see, the white roses her mother had planted before dying of cancer when Rebecca was only 15, and the vineyards her great-grandfather had brought from France at the beginning of the last century. Her morning routine was as invariable as the sunrise. After a prolonged bath in the marble bathtub, she chose one among dozens of outfits that occupied a closet, the size of an entire apartment in East LA. Always discreet, elegant pieces that reflected the rigid education she had received in Swiss boarding schools and the constant supervision of English governesses who shaped her gestures, her posture, and even the way she breathed in public. Rebecca grew up knowing exactly what her place in the world was. The only daughter of one of the most traditional families in Southern California, educated to be the perfect wife of some equally noble heir, trained from childhood to smile just the right amount, to speak only when requested, and never to question decisions made by the men in her family. Her entire life was designed by other people. Her father chose her schools. Her friends were pre-selected among daughters of approved families. Her interests were directed toward activities considered appropriate for young ladies of good family. At 27, Rebecca spoke French, English, Italian, and Spanish fluently. She had played classical piano since she was 5, painted delicate watercolors that decorated some rooms of the mansion, and knew everything about etiquette, art, literature, and wine. But she had never worked, never taken a bus alone, didn't know the price of a pound of rice, and had no idea how a bank account worked. Her life was a crystal dome, beautiful to observe from the outside, but suffocating for those who lived inside it. What most intrigued those who knew her was her deliberate choice to remain single. At 27, in a society that demanded marriage and children from women of her social class, Rebecca had refused all the suitors her father had presented over the years, not out of disobedience or rebellion, but from a deep intuition that she would give her life only to someone who saw her as a person, not as an asset to be managed. Her hands, accustomed only to the delicate touch of piano keys and the careful handling of antique books, had never known the skin of another human being with intentions beyond education or social courtesy. Her body, guarded not by direct family imposition but by an intimate pact with herself, remained untouched, not out of fear of sex or excessive moralism, but from the almost naive hope that, one day, she would give herself completely to someone who desired her not as a possession or trophy, but as an extension of their own soul. Rebecca spent her days dividing her time between piano lessons with renowned teachers, art courses at Los Angeles museums, discreet volunteer work at charities, approved by her father, and long walks through the property gardens. It was a predictable, safe, comfortable life, but one that lately had begun to provoke a strange feeling of emptiness, as if she were missing something important without knowing exactly what. It was on one of these mornings, seemingly identical to all others, that Mercedes knocked on her bedroom door with an expression Rebecca had never seen on the housekeeper's face: nervousness, concern, and something that seemed very much like fear. "Miss Rebecca, your father is asking you to come down to the office immediately. There are visitors waiting." The word visitors sounded strange in Mercedes' mouth. The Harrison family didn't receive unexpected visits. Everything was scheduled, programmed, filtered by her father's personal secretaries. Rebecca descended the marble staircase she knew by heart, but something in the house's atmosphere seemed different. The employees whispered among themselves, avoided her gaze, and a heavy silence hung over the mansion that normally echoed with classical music and polite conversations. When she pushed open the mahogany and leather door to the office where her father had conducted the family business for decades, Rebecca found Henry Harrison sitting behind the desk, as always, but his curved posture and ashen face told a completely different story. In front of him, in one of the leather armchairs, sat a man Rebecca had never seen, but who radiated a magnetic and disturbing presence. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled the dark, tailored suit. His black hair was elegantly combed back, revealing a face with striking features that could have come from a Renaissance sculpture. But it was his eyes that most drew attention, grey like a storm forming at sea, cold as ice, but with an intensity that seemed capable of burning everything around. When Rebecca entered the room, the man stood up with the natural elegance of someone born to command, and for the first time in her life, she felt as if someone could see through her soul with just a look. It wasn't admiration she saw in those grey eyes. It was something much more dangerous. It was possession. "Rebecca, I want you to meet Alexander Steele." Henry Harrison's voice came out hoarse, broken, as if each word cost him a piece of his soul. "Mr. Steele, my daughter, Rebecca." Alexander extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and when Rebecca touched his skin for the first time, an electric current ran through her entire body. His hands were large, calloused from the work of a youth she had never known, but soft from the success he had achieved. The grip was firm, lasted a few seconds longer than would be socially appropriate, and Rebecca felt as if he were memorizing the texture of her skin. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Rebecca. I've been hearing about your beauty and elegance for years in Los Angeles social circles." His voice was deep, velvety, with an almost imperceptible local accent that Alexander had worked to soften during years of mixing with the international elite. But Rebecca, with her refined education to detect social nuances, noticed something her etiquette teachers had never mentioned. There was a dangerous hunger hidden behind that impeccable courtesy. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Steele." Rebecca gently withdrew her hand, but could still feel the warmth of his fingers on her skin. "Father, may I know the reason for this meeting? I don't usually participate in your business meetings." Henry Harrison looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, or perhaps as if it were the last. In recent months, since discovering the real dimension of the financial crisis befalling the family, he had avoided involving Rebecca in the problems, hoping to find a solution that would preserve the protected life he had built for her. But there was no more time, no miracles, no honorable exits. "Sit down, daughter." The tone was of someone preparing to pronounce a death sentence. "We need to talk about the future of our family." Rebecca obeyed, choosing the armchair furthest from Alexander, but she could still feel the weight of his gaze upon her. It was as if he were studying every movement, every reaction, every beat of her accelerated heart. She had never felt so observed, so vulnerable, even fully clothed. "Our financial situation has changed dramatically in recent months." Henry struggled to find words that could soften the brutality of the facts. "The investments we made in recent years, the FBI, investigations into some of our business partners, the changes in the economy. We are facing significant difficulties." Alexander remained silent, but the smile on his lips was that of a predator who knew exactly when to strike. He had waited decades for this moment, planned each move like a chess master anticipating checkmate, 20 moves in advance. "Difficulties?" Rebecca frowned, confused. In her protected life, she had never heard her father mention financial problems. The family had always seemed untouchable, shielded against the crises that affected the rest of the country. "What kind of difficulties?" "We're bankrupt, Rebecca." The words came out like a slap. "Completely bankrupt. Our accounts are frozen, the properties will be auctioned, the debts far exceed everything we own. In a matter of weeks, we'll lose everything at the mansion, the farms, even your mother's jewelry." Rebecca's world collapsed in a matter of seconds. The crystal dome that protected her shattered like glass, hit by a stone. For the first time in 27 years, she was face to face with a reality that had always existed for other people, never for her. Poverty, dishonor, the prospect of losing not just material goods but her very place in the world. "How is this possible?" Her voice came out weak, incredulous. "I don't understand. We've always been rich." Alexander finally spoke, and there was a sweet venom in his voice. "Respected, untouchable. Traditional families have a very dramatic fall when they fall, don't they? Very different from those born on the ground, who had to build everything from scratch." Rebecca looked at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion beginning to form in her mind. There was something in the way he spoke, a strange familiarity with her family's humiliation, as if he knew more than he appeared to. Mr. Steele came here today to present us with a proposal, Henry continued, avoiding looking directly at his daughter. A way to resolve our situation. I am the largest creditor of the Harrison family. Alexander leaned back in the armchair like a king on his throne. Your debts to me, just to me, exceed $80 million. Money I lent for projects that never materialized, investments that proved fraudulent, loans that were never repaid. 80 million. The number echoed in Rebecca's mind like thunder. It was an impossible amount to be paid, astronomical for any family, even one that had once been very wealthy. But I'm a businessman, not a loan shark, Alexander continued, and now there was something dangerously seductive in his voice. I believe there's always a way to negotiate, to find an agreement that benefits all parties involved. What kind of agreement? Rebecca asked, though a part of her already suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Alexander stood up, walked to the window that overlooked the gardens where Rebecca had spent her entire childhood, and when he turned to face her again, there was an intensity in his eyes that made her shiver. Marriage. The word dropped like a bomb in the silence of the office. So you marry me, Rebecca, and all your family's debts are forgiven, completely. You can keep the mansion, a part of the properties, an amount sufficient for you to live with dignity for the rest of your lives. Rebecca felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Marriage. To a stranger. A man who looked at her as if she were an object to be acquired, not a person to be loved. That's it. Her voice came out as a horrified whisper. You're selling me. Rebecca, it's not what you're thinking. Henry Harrison rose from his chair, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Gad 62, the patriarch who once commanded an economic empire in Southern California, now looked like a defeated man, bent not just by time, but by the humiliation of having to negotiate his own daughter's life. It's a legitimate marriage, a union that can be beneficial for both families. Beneficial? Rebecca jumped up, and for the first time in 27 years of refined education, her voice came out altered, carrying an indignation she never knew she possessed. Father, you're negotiating my life as if I were an Arabian horse or a Renaissance painting. How can you call this beneficial? Alexander watched the confrontation between father and daughter with the patience of an experienced hunter. He had imagined this scene hundreds of times over the years, planned every word, every movement, every possible reaction. Rebecca's indignation was not only anticipated in his calculations, it was exactly what he expected. Women raised in crystal domes always reacted this way, when they discovered that the real world was much crueler than their fairy tales. Rebecca, please try to understand. Henry approached his daughter, but she backed away as if his touch could contaminate her. We have no choice. If we don't accept this proposal, we'll lose everything. Do you know what that means? Do you know what happens to people like us when we fall? We won't even have a place to live. Creditors won't have mercy on the fact that you're an educated, delicate woman. They'll take even the clothes off your back. Then let them, Rebecca shouted, surprising herself with her own vehemence. I'd rather live under a bridge than be sold like merchandise. How romantic. Alexander finally spoke again, and there was a cutting irony in his voice. But allow me to clarify some points about the reality you apparently don't know. First, you wouldn't have a clue how to survive under a bridge, as you so poetically put it. Second, it wouldn't be just you suffering the consequences. Your father is 62, has heart problems, and has never worked with his own hands. Mercedes, the housekeeper who has taken care of you for 20 years, would also lose her job and be on the street. The 15 employees who work on this property, their families, all depend on the financial stability of the Harrisons. Each of Alexander's words was a calculated stab at Rebecca's conscience. He knew exactly where to attack to cause maximum psychological damage, like a surgeon who knows human anatomy in minute detail. Guilt was a much more effective weapon than brute force when it came to women raised to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. Besides, Alexander continued, walking slowly toward Rebecca, who backed up until she bumped into the bookcase. I have antique books. Perhaps you're judging this situation hastily. I'm a successful man. internationally respected, without vices or scandals. I can offer a comfortable, even luxurious life. Many women would consider such a proposal a gift from destiny. Many women who didn't have the choice to say no. Rebecca raised her chin in a gesture of dignity that contrasted with the desperation in her eyes. Many women who were raised to believe they need a man to have value in the world. And what were you raised for exactly? Alexander's question came with a smile that was pure, refined malice. To be independent? To work? To survive alone in the real world? Forgive my observation, but you were educated to be exactly this, the wife of a rich and powerful man. The only difference is that now you don't have the luxury of choosing which man it will be. The truth contained in those words hit Rebecca like a slap. All her education, all the skills she had developed throughout her life, piano, painting, languages, etiquette, were ornaments created to make her a desirable wife for men of her social class. She had never learned a profession, never developed practical skills for survival, never had to make really important decisions about her own life. You don't know me. Rebecca tried to keep her voice firm, but there was a tremor that revealed her growing insecurity. You don't know what I'm capable of. I know more about you than you imagine. Alexander stopped just a meter away from her, so close that Rebecca could smell the masculine aroma of his expensive perfume mixed with something more primitive, more dangerous. I know you've never worked a single day. I know you've never taken a bus alone, never been to a bank to solve a problem, never had to cook your own food. I know your bank account has a limit of $5,000 a month for personal expenses, controlled by your father. I know you've never made an important decision about your own life. How did he know all these intimate details? Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. There was something deeply disturbing about the way Alexander knew her life, as if he had studied every aspect of her existence for years. I also know, he continued, lowering his voice to an almost whispered tone, that you spent the last few years rejecting all the suitors your father presented. That you chose to remain single, not out of freedom, but out of fear. Fear of giving yourself to someone who truly wouldn't deserve you. Rebecca felt her face heat up. How dare he talk about her most intimate choices as if they were public data? I'm offering a contract, Rebecca. Clear, direct, without romantic lies or empty promises. You marry me, fulfill the basic duties of a wife, and in return have financial security, a comfortable life, and the guarantee that your family won't end up in misery. It's an honest commercial transaction. Duties of a wife, Rebecca repeated, the words as if they were poison in her mouth. What duties exactly? Alexander smiled, and this time there was something predatory in his expression that made Rebecca's heart race. All the duties, Rebecca. All of them. Rebecca spent 3 days locked in her room, 3 days that seemed like 3 years of silent agony. For the first time in her protected life, she faced a decision that would completely change the course of her existence, and there were no English governesses or private tutors to guide her on which choice to make. It was her, just her, against a dilemma that seemed to have no right solution. Through the windows of the room, she observed the gardens that would soon perhaps no longer be hers, the white roses her mother had planted that now seemed to wither even in full bloom. Mercedes came up with trays of food that returned untouched, and Rebecca noticed in the housekeeper's eyes a concern that went beyond the well-being of an employer. It was the genuine fear of a woman who knew that her own stability depended on the decisions being made in that house. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca came down for breakfast, dressed in a navy blue dress she had carefully chosen, a color that always gave her strength in the most difficult moments. She found her father sitting at the dining room table in front of a coffee that was cooling untouched, looking out the window with the expression of someone who had already given up fighting. I want to see the contract, her voice came out, firmer than she expected. I want to read every clause, every condition, every fine print before making any decision. Henry looked at his daughter with a mixture of surprise and relief. He had feared that she would choose escape, literal or figurative, leaving the whole family to sink with her. But there was Rebecca, no longer the protected girl who had grown up under his care, but a woman preparing to face one of the most difficult decisions a human being can make. Alexander left the documents here last night. Henry pulled a leather folder from the side table. Our lawyers have already reviewed it. It's surprisingly fair considering the circumstances. Rebecca opened the folder with hands that trembled only slightly and began to read. The contract was extensive, written in the technical and cold language of law, but each clause was written with a clarity that left no room for doubt or convenient interpretations. Contract of matrimonial union and financial agreement between Alexander August Steele and Rebecca Elizabeth Harrison. The first lines already made it clear that this was much more than a marriage. It was a commercial transaction disguised as a religious sacrament. The financial conditions were indeed generous. Alexander would assume all the debts of the Harrison family, would allow them to keep the Pacific Palisades mansion and one of the smaller farms, and would guarantee a lifelong monthly income for Henry that would allow him to maintain a dignified standard of living. Mercedes and the other employees would keep their jobs, their homes on the property, their salaries paid in full. But the personal clauses were what really made Rebecca's stomach turn. The wife will reside in the husband's main residence in Fideuam, Los Angeles, accompanying him on all business trips and social events that he deems necessary. The wife will fulfill all conjugal duties inherent to matrimony, including but not limited to maintaining domestic harmony and procreation. The wife will not maintain contact with people not approved by the husband, will not make financial decisions without consulting him, and will not engage in activities that could compromise the reputation of the Steele family. It was a contract of modern slavery disguised as marriage. Rebecca would be a porcelain doll in a golden display case, beautiful to be exhibited, but without her own will, without freedom of choice, without the right to her own life. But the clause that disturbed her the most was at the end of the document, in smaller print than the others. This contract will be valid for 5 years, renewable by mutual agreement of the parties. After this period, if not renewed, the wife will receive compensation of $10 million and may keep the Pacific Palisades residence as a lifetime property. 5 years. He was buying 5 years of her life for $10 million. $2 million per year. That was how he calculated the value of her existence. He will be here at 4 o'clock for the answer. Henry couldn't look directly at his daughter. Rebecca, Don't say anything, Father. Rebecca closed the contract and put it back in the folder. Don't try to convince me that this is right or wrong. We both know exactly what it is. At 4 o'clock sharp, as promised, Alexander arrived at the mansion. This time he didn't come alone. He brought a lawyer, a notary, and a photographer whose function Rebecca didn't immediately understand. He was dressed in an impeccable grey suit that probably cost more than the annual salary of 3 employees of the property, and carried a confident expression of someone who already knew the answer before even asking the question. Rebecca. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek that lasted a few seconds longer than socially appropriate, and she could smell the masculine scent of his skin, the texture of his well-groomed beard against her face. I hope you've had enough time to consider my proposal. Your proposal, Rebecca repeated the words with bitter irony. Is that what you're calling it now? What would you prefer I call it? Alexander smiled, but there was something dangerous in his eyes. An opportunity? A solution? Salvation? For your family. Rebecca took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was an iron determination in her expression that surprised even herself. I accept your conditions. The words came out clear, firm, without hesitation, but I want to add my own clause to the contract. Alexander raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. During all the years he had planned this moment, he hadn't considered the possibility of Rebecca trying to negotiate. What kind of clause? I want it included in the contract that you will never force me to do anything I don't voluntarily accept, that my body and my mind remain mine, even being your wife legally. Alexander studied, her face for long seconds that seemed eternal. There was something in Rebecca's expression that he hadn't expected. It wasn't submission, it wasn't despair. It was a silent strength, a dignity that remained intact even in the face of the humiliation of the situation. "I accept your clause." He extended his hand to her. "We have an agreement, then." When Rebecca touched his hand to seal the agreement that would change her life forever, she felt as if she was signing a contract with the devil himself. But perhaps, she thought, that was exactly what she was doing. The photographer fired the flash at that moment, capturing for posterity the instant when Rebecca Harrison sold 5 years of her life to save her family from ruin. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a ceremony that People magazine described as the social event of the year in Los Angeles. The Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels was decorated with thousands of white roses imported from Ecuador, and the guest list read like a who's who of American economic and political elite. Senators, governors, businessmen from the most diverse sectors, socialites whose only occupation was to appear at events like that, all there to witness what they believed to be a modern fairy tale. Rebecca walked down the aisle dressed in an Ely Saab that cost more than $200,000, the most expensive dress she had ever worn, but which felt like a shroud of silk on her skin. The 6-meter-long French lace veil had belonged to Alexander's great-grandmother, a family tradition that she didn't know whether to consider an honor or a curse. Each step toward the altar was a struggle against the instinct to flee, to lift the skirt of the dress and run far away from that theater of lies. Alexander was waiting for her at the altar dressed in a tailored Armani tuxedo, and when their eyes met, Rebecca felt again that disturbing electric current running through her body. He was devastatingly handsome, a man who seemed to have stepped out of the pages of a men's fashion magazine, but there was something in his expression that made her hesitate. It wasn't the cold and calculating look she expected. There was something softer, almost vulnerable. The religious ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Los Angeles in person, a political favor that Alexander had obtained through generous donations to the church. The words of the sacrament echoed through the packed cathedral, but Rebecca barely heard them. She was too focused on Alexander's proximity, on the masculine smell of his perfume mixed with the aroma of roses, on the way he held her hands with a gentleness that contrasted with the coldness of the contract they had signed. When the time came for the vows, Alexander surprised everyone, including Rebecca, by improvising words that weren't in the rehearsed script. "Rebecca, I promise. I will give you a life worthy of the extraordinary woman you are. I promise to protect you, respect you, and do everything in my power to make you happy by my side." His voice was firm, but there was a sincerity in those words that made something tremble in Rebecca's chest. When her turn came, Rebecca uttered the traditional vows they had rehearsed, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she promise love when she didn't even know this man? How could she swear fidelity when she was being forced into a marriage she hadn't chosen? The kiss that sealed the union lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough time for Rebecca to feel the texture of Alexander's lips, warm and surprisingly soft, and a wave of heat that ran through her entire body in a completely unexpected way. When they separated, there was something different in his gaze, an intensity that made her heart race. The wedding reception took place at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, with decorations that cost more than $500,000 and a menu signed by a French chef specially hired for the occasion. Rebecca smiled for hundreds of photos, greeted people she didn't know, and played the role of the happy bride with a perfection that years of etiquette education had provided her. But it was during the traditional waltz, when Alexander took her in his arms for the first dance as husband and wife, that Rebecca felt for the first time the true danger of her situation. Not physical danger, he had promised to respect her, but something much more threatening. The way her body reacted to his touch, how her heart accelerated when he whispered instructions about the dance steps in her ear, how a primitive part of her mind began to imagine what it would be like to surrender completely to him. "You're trembling," Alexander murmured as he guided her through the waltz steps, his large, warm hand resting on Rebecca's bare back. "Are you cold?" "I'm afraid." The honesty of the answer surprised them both. Rebecca hadn't planned to be so direct, but something in his proximity, in the forced intimacy of that moment, made the words come out before she could contain them. Of me? There was a vulnerability in the question that Rebecca didn't expect to hear from such a powerful man. Of myself. The answer was even more honest than the previous one, and Rebecca saw something change in Alexander's expression. For an instant, the mask of the implacable businessman fell, and she saw a man who was perhaps as lost as she was in that situation. The night progressed in a succession of toasts, speeches, and musical performances that included everything from a classical pianist to a jazz band that presented a special number created for the occasion. Rebecca smiled, talked, thanked compliments, but her mind was increasingly focused on what would happen when the party ended, when they would be alone for the first time as husband and wife. It was almost midnight when Alexander approached her. During a break between musical performances, "We can leave whenever you want." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "We don't need to stay until the end if you're tired." Rebecca looked around the hall, still full of guests, drinking French champagne and dancing as if the party could last forever. Part of her wanted to postpone the inevitable, to prolong that facade of celebration, to avoid facing the reality of what awaited her. But another part, a part that scared her, wanted to be alone with Alexander, wanted to discover who was the man behind the mask of the implacable magnate. "We can go." She nodded, and Alexander discreetly led her out of the hall, ignoring the protests of guests who wanted to prolong the celebration. The car waiting for them, a bulletproof Mercedes driven by a driver in a dark suit, took them through the illuminated streets of Beverly Hills toward Malibu, where Alexander's penthouse was located. Throughout the journey, they remained in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but Rebecca could feel the electric tension that filled the space between them on the car's leather seat. When they arrived at the building, a modern skyscraper with a privileged view of the beach, Alexander helped her out of the car with a gentleness that contrasted with the brutality of the circumstances that had united them. In the private elevator that led directly to the penthouse, Rebecca found herself observing the reflection of the two in the mirror. She still dressed in the $200,000 wedding dress, he with the tuxedo slightly disheveled after hours of partying. They looked like a couple out of a fairy tale, but both knew that reality was much more complex and dangerous. Alexander's penthouse was exactly what Rebecca had imagined the home of a man like him would be, an impressive architectural space that screamed power and wealth, but that seemed completely devoid of soul. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Malibu and the Pacific Ocean, but the walls were too white, the furniture too modern, everything too perfect and cold, like a luxury decoration showroom. "Would you like something to drink?" Alexander asked, loosening the tuxedo tie as he walked toward the crystal bar that occupied an entire wall of the room. There was something forcedly casual in his posture, as if he too were nervous, though trying to disguise it. "Champagne, please," Rebecca replied, not because she wanted alcohol, but because she needed something to do with her hands, something to occupy her mind during the minutes that preceded the inevitable. She still wore the wedding dress, which now seemed heavy and uncomfortable, like armor that protected her from nothing. Alexander served 2 glasses of the best French champagne he owned, but when he approached to hand it to her, their hands touched briefly, and both felt that familiar electric current. Rebecca took a larger sip than she intended, trying to calm the nerves that seemed to be on fire under her skin. "Rebecca," Alexander began, but the words seemed to die in his throat. For 23 years he had planned this moment, imagined what it would be like to finally possess the daughter of the man who destroyed his family. But now, with her standing before him, beautiful and vulnerable in that wedding dress that cost a fortune, reality was much more complex than his thirst for revenge had anticipated. Can we just talk first?" Rebecca asked, her voice coming out weaker than she would like. "I mean, we're strangers, aren't we? Maybe we should get to know each other a little before—" "Before what?" Alexander asked, but there was a gentleness in his voice that she didn't expect. "Rebecca, you don't need to be afraid of me. I know the circumstances of our marriage weren't the most romantic, but I'm not a monster." Rebecca studied him for long seconds, trying to see beyond the mask of the implacable businessman. "Who are you really, Alexander? Because I know you're not just a businessman who decided to marry me for convenience." There's something more, isn't there? Something personal. The question hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. Rebecca was more perceptive than he had calculated, smarter than the superficial education she had received might suggest. For a moment he considered lying, maintaining the facade, but there was something in her eyes that prevented him from continuing to pretend. "Your family destroyed mine." The words came out rawer than he intended. "Many years ago, and I spent my entire life planning how to get revenge." Rebecca felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "Revenge? I am your revenge?" "You were supposed to be." Alexander placed the champagne glass on the coffee table with more force than necessary. "But things are more complicated than I imagined." "Complicated how?" Rebecca moved away from him, the wedding dress rustling around her feet. "Are you having regrets? Have you discovered it's not so easy to ruin a person when you have to look them in the eye?" "I discovered that you're not who I thought you were." Alexander ran his hand through his hair, messing up the perfect hairstyle he had maintained all day. "I thought I would find a spoiled princess, superficial, a porcelain doll created just to be displayed. But you have courage, dignity, intelligence." "And does that change anything?" Rebecca asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. "I'm still the daughter of the man you hate. I'm still a trophy you bought to get revenge on him." Alexander approached her again, slowly, as if she were a wild animal that could flee at any moment. "Rebecca, what your father did was terrible, unforgivable, but you're not guilty of his sins. And I don't want you to pay for crimes you didn't commit." "Then let me go." Her voice came out as a desperate whisper. "Annul the marriage, forgive the debts anyway, and let me leave." "I can't," Alexander answered with brutal honesty. "Not because I don't want to, but because—" He hesitated, struggling with words he had never said to anyone. "Because I don't want you to go away." Rebecca stared at him with a mixture of confusion and something that could be hope. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." Alexander laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "For 23 years, I planned every move to reach this moment. And now that you're here, I've discovered I don't want to destroy you. I want to protect you." The confession hung in the air between them like a fragile bridge over an abyss. Rebecca felt something changing inside her chest, a crack in the anger and fear she had felt since the day he appeared at her house with that infamous proposal. "Alexander." She approached him, and when she raised her hand to touch his face, he closed his eyes as if her touch was both pleasure and pain. "What happened to your family? What did my father do?" "My mother." Alexander opened his eyes, and Rebecca saw a pain so deep that her heart tightened. "She killed herself because of him, because of the humiliation, the way she was treated, discarded. I found her, Rebecca. I was just a boy, and I found my mother dead because of a man who played with her as if she were a disposable toy." Rebecca felt tears welling in her eyes. She finally understood the origin of the fury she saw in Alexander's grey eyes, the pain he carried like armor. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what she suffered, for what you suffered." "You're not to blame." Alexander took her face in his hands, and the touch was infinitely gentle. "And I shouldn't have put you in the middle of this, but now I don't know how to get out of this situation without hurting you even more." Rebecca looked deeply into his eyes and saw something that frightened and at the same time reassured her. It wasn't just desire she saw there. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the beginning of something that could turn into love, if both allowed it. "Then don't leave." The words came out before she could think better. Maybe we can discover together how to transform this situation into something real." Alexander looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't deserve. "Rebecca, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know who I really am, what I'm capable of." "Then show me." She moved closer until their bodies almost touched. "Show me who you are when you're not hiding behind contracts and revenge." When Alexander finally kissed her, it wasn't the predatory kiss Rebecca expected, but something infinitely more dangerous. It was a kiss full of promises that he didn't even know if he could keep. full of a tenderness that surprised him as much as her. The kiss deepened slowly, as if both were discovering unexplored territories, not only in each other's body, but in their own souls. Alexander slid his hands along Rebecca's bare arms, feeling the soft, warm skin under his fingers, and she responded by putting her arms around his neck, allowing herself, for the first time in her life, to experience what it meant to truly desire a man. When they finally separated, both were breathing irregularly, and there was an intensity in the air that made the hair on Rebecca's arms stand up. Alexander looked at her as if trying to memorize every detail of her face, every expression that passed through her dark eyes. "Rebecca." His voice was hoarse, charged with a desire he no longer tried to hide. "Are you sure about what you're doing? Because if you say yes now, there will be no turning back. This marriage will no longer be just a contract." Rebecca studied his face, seeing the vulnerability that Alexander tried to hide behind the mask of control. For the first time in 27 years of protected life, she made a decision based purely on what her heart wanted, not on what was expected of her, or what would be most sensible. Yes. The word came out as a whisper, but with a conviction that surprised them both. "I want it to be real." Alexander took her in his arms, as if she were made of Venetian crystal, carrying her to the penthouse's main bedroom. The environment was as luxurious as the rest of the house, but Rebecca barely noticed the decoration. She was too focused on how her body reacted to his proximity, on the completely new sensations that ran through every nerve ending. When Alexander placed her on her feet beside the king-size bed, his hands trembled slightly as they sought the zipper of the wedding dress. Rebecca closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel each touch, each delicate caress as he slid the dress off her shoulders. The expensive silk slid down her body like water, pooling at her feet in a puddle of fabric that cost more than many people, earned in a year. When Alexander saw Rebecca wearing only the French lingerie she had specially chosen for the wedding night, something changed in his expression. It wasn't just desire she saw in his eyes. It was an almost religious reverence, as if she were a work of art he didn't know if he deserved to touch. "You are perfect." The words came out like a whispered prayer. Rebecca felt her face heat up with the compliment and the intensity of his gaze. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, but also so powerful. She saw the effect she had on him, the desire he couldn't hide, and for the first time understood the power a woman could have over a man. Alexander began to unbutton his tuxedo shirt, but Rebecca surprised him by placing her hands over his. "Let me." Her voice was hoarse, charged with a sensuality she didn't know she possessed. With fingers that trembled only slightly, Rebecca unbuttoned each button of his shirt, revealing a sculpted torso that told the story of a man who had fought to get where he was. He wasn't just an executive who spent his days sitting behind a desk. There were defined muscles, some scars whose origin she didn't dare ask about, a virility that made her belly contract with desire. When they were finally just in their underwear, Alexander laid her on the bed with a gentleness that contrasted with the passion burning in his eyes. He began to kiss her neck, her shoulders, every inch of exposed skin, and Rebecca lost herself in sensations she had never experienced. It was when Alexander slid his hand along her thigh, seeking the intimacy of her body, that he discovered something that made him stop immediately. Rebecca was a virgin, completely untouched. The realization hit him like lightning, and he moved away slightly, looking at her with an expression of total shock. "Rebecca." His voice was charged with astonishment and something that seemed like guilt. "You never—" Rebecca felt her face burn with shame, interpreting his reaction as disappointment. No, I never gave myself to anyone. I'm sorry if that's a problem for you." "A problem?" Alexander laughed, but it was a sound charged with admiration and something that could be reverence. "Rebecca, you don't understand. You were keeping something so precious, so pure, and I was taking it from you for revenge." "You're not taking it." Rebecca raised her hand to touch his face, seeing the internal struggle unfolding in his gray eyes. "I'm giving it, by my choice." Alexander closed his eyes, pressing his face against her hand. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." "Maybe not." Rebecca surprised them both with the brutal honesty of the answer. "But life rarely gives us what we deserve, does it? Sometimes it just gives us what we need." At that moment, Alexander understood that his carefully elaborated plan had completely fallen apart. He could no longer pretend that this was just revenge, just a commercial transaction. Rebecca had become real to him, a woman of flesh and blood who touched him in ways he didn't know was possible. "If we do this," he whispered against her lips, "there will be no more lies between us. Just the truth, no matter how painful it may be. Just the truth." Rebecca agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of a new beginning. What happened next was a mutual discovery that lasted hours. Alexander, who had always viewed sex as conquest or physical necessity, discovered what it meant to make love to someone who touched his soul. Rebecca, who had guarded her virginity for 27 years waiting for something worth it, finally understood why she had waited so long. When they finally fell asleep, exhausted and intertwined, both knew that something irreversible had happened. The cold contract they had signed had transformed into something real, dangerous, beautiful. But Rebecca carried a secret she had not yet shared with Alexander. Hidden among her personal belongings that had been brought from the Pacific Palisades mansion was a letter yellowed by time, a correspondence her mother had given her before dying, asking that it only be opened when Rebecca married. The letter contained a revelation that could destroy everything they were building. An old suspicion, a family secret that her mother had taken almost to the grave, but had left recorded in a trembling handwriting. The possibility that Alexander and Rebecca were half-siblings, children of the same father. Henry Harrison had been a man of many secrets and many women, and one of them had been Carmen, Alexander's mother. As Alexander slept beside her, deep and regular breathing, Rebecca looked at the ceiling of the luxurious penthouse and wondered if the love she had begun to feel for him would be strong enough to survive the truth, or if this would be just the first of many obstacles that fate would place in their way. Outside, dawn was beginning to color the Los Angeles sky with shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new life, new challenges. And Rebecca, for the first time, felt ready to face them, even if it meant fighting against fate itself. 3 months passed since the wedding night that transformed a marriage of convenience into something dangerously real. Rebecca had moved completely to the penthouse in Malibu, and gradually she was discovering facets of Alexander she never imagined existed. In the morning, he woke her with breakfasts he prepared personally, a skill acquired during his difficult youth in Compton. At night, they talked for hours about everything and nothing, he telling stories of his struggle to escape poverty, she sharing dreams she had never shared with anyone. But the secret of the letter weighed on Rebecca like a Damocles sword. Each moment of happiness was contaminated by the possibility that their love was forbidden by nature, not just by circumstances. 3 times she had tried to tell Alexander about her mother's suspicion, but the words died in her throat every time she saw the peace in his eyes, the first genuine peace he seemed to have known in decades. It was on a Thursday afternoon that their world began to crumble. Rebecca was on the penthouse terrace reading a book and enjoying the sea breeze when the intercom rang announcing an unexpected visit. Jack Ferris, a businessman she vaguely knew from Los Angeles social circles, was coming up to meet her. Jack was a man in his 50s, with an appearance that tried to disguise cruelty with superficial charm. He had been Alexander's rival in some business dealings over the years, always losing to the younger, smarter man. Now he brought a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a leather folder that Rebecca immediately knew contained problems. "Rebecca, what a pleasure to see you again." Jack kissed her hand with exaggerated gallantry. "I hope you're happy with your new marriage." "Very happy, thank you." Rebecca maintained courtesy, but there was something in his presence that made her feel uncomfortable. "Alexander isn't home at the moment. Can I take a message?" "Actually, I came to talk to you." Jack opened the folder and removed some photographs and documents. "About some interesting secrets I discovered about your family, and about your husband's family." Rebecca felt the blood freeze in her veins when she saw the photos. They were old images, yellowed by time, of a young and beautiful woman she immediately recognized. Her mother at 20, in intimate situations with a man she took a few seconds to recognize. Henry Harrison, her father. But the date on the photos was more than 40 years ago, even before she was born. Your mother had a prolonged affair with your father before officially marrying him. Jack spoke with the satisfaction of someone who knew he was destroying lives. And during that period, she also got involved with other men. One of them was a cleaner named Carmen, who became pregnant and claimed the child was Henry's. Rebecca's hands trembled as she held the photographs. The suspicion in her mother's letter was taking on an even more terrible dimension. "You want money?" It wasn't a question. "I want to see Alexander Steele destroyed," Jack smiled, and now the malice was visible. "He humiliated me in business one too many times, and discovering that he married his own sister would be a delicious scandal. For the press, don't you think?" Rebecca felt nausea rising in her throat. "You have no proof of anything. These are just assumptions based on old photos." "I have more than that." Jack placed a sealed envelope on the table. "A DNA test done with hair samples I got during your wedding party. The results arrived yesterday." Rebecca looked at the envelope as if it contained a venomous snake. She didn't dare open it, but she couldn't ignore it either. The fate of her marriage, of her love, of her entire life was in that piece of paper. "What do you want?" Her voice came out weak, defeated. $10 million to keep quiet. And I want you to leave Alexander publicly, in a humiliating way. I want the world to see that not even by buying a wife can he be happy. It was at that moment that Alexander arrived home, returning early from a meeting because he wanted to surprise Rebecca with a romantic trip he had planned to Palm Springs. What he found was his wife pale as a sheet of paper, a man he hated sitting in his living room, and photographs spread across the table that told a story he had never imagined. "Jack," Alexander's voice was pure ice. "What an unexpected honor." "Alexander, just the person I wanted to see." Jack stood up with evident satisfaction. "I was just telling your lovely wife about some interesting discoveries about your respective families." Alexander looked at the photographs and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His mother, Carmen, in the photos that Jack displayed, together with Henry Harrison. The possibility he had never considered suddenly became real and terrifying. "Get out of my house," Alexander approached Jack with a dangerous calm. "Now, of course. I'll leave you to discuss family matters." Jack put away the papers but left the DNA envelope on the table. "Rebecca has my number. I expect an answer in 48 hours. When Jack left, a sepulchral silence took over the penthouse. Rebecca and Alexander looked at each other as if they were strangers, the weight of the possibility hanging between them like an insurmountable abyss. "Is it true?" Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. Rebecca picked up the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. She read the result once, twice, 3 times before she could process what was written there. "No." She began to cry, but they were tears of relief. "No, Alexander, we are not siblings. The DNA proves we have no kinship." Alexander took the paper from her hands and confirmed the result. There was no blood relationship between them. The suspicion was false, based on coincidences and the manipulations of people who wanted to use their pain against them. "But my mother," Rebecca was still sobbing. "She believed that..." She wrote in a letter. "Your mother was trying to protect you." Alexander took her in his arms, holding her against his chest. "She probably found out about my birth and got scared, but never had certainty. And Jack manipulated the situation, forged evidence, created doubts where they shouldn't exist." That night, they burned the old photographs, Rebecca's mother's, letter, and all traces of the secrets that had almost destroyed their happiness. Alexander contacted his lawyers and private investigators, and within weeks, Jack was facing criminal charges for blackmail, document forgery, and extortion. 6. Months later, Alexander and Rebecca were on a deserted beach in Santa Barbara, renewing the vows they had made out of obligation and transforming them into true promises of love. This time there were no guests, no press, no contracts. Just the two of them, a local pastor and the ocean as witness. "I promise to love you not for revenge, not out of duty, but because you are the half of my soul that I didn't know I was looking for." Alexander spoke, holding Rebecca's hands as the waves bathed their bare feet. "I promise that our love will be the redemption of all the pain that our families have carried for generations," Rebecca replied, and when they kissed there was sea salt on their lips and tears of happiness in their eyes. A year later, Rebecca gave birth to a girl they named Hope. The child was born free from the ghosts of the past, the daughter of a love that triumphed over revenge, hatred, blackmail, and family secrets. Alexander never again became the cold and calculating man he had been. Rebecca was never again the porcelain doll created to be displayed. Together, they built not just a marriage, but a new lineage based on true love, where the wounds of the past finally healed. And when they told the story of how they met to their daughter,